don't just look around you and say, well, I'm mostly in a support role and there isn't really much area for growth or learning for me, or I'm working under marketing and there isn't really an opportunity for growth for me, or I'm in a really small company and there isn't opportunity necessarily for growth if I just focus on docs. I think there are lots of opportunities to learn, and then you can take those opportunities and either build a new career path for yourself if you like something more than the writing, or you can take those skills and then build a larger scope for yourself in your existing company, or take those skills to the next opportunity that you have.
Welcome to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast, where Gowri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Good day, everyone. Our guest today is Nicola Yap, technical writer at Google. Welcome, Nicola, to the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's Friday, so I'm looking forward to going into the weekend.
Super. So, Nicola, please help us understand a little bit more about yourself and how did you initially got into documentation?
So, like a lot of other people who are in technical writing, I fell into it by accident. I actually wasn't really sure what I wanted to do when I was going into post-secondary education. So I had considered going into journalism, and I was concerned that if I had specialized really narrowly and I didn't like it, that I was going to be stuck with this specialized set of skills. So I actually majored in psychology initially and then went into translation. I knew that I really enjoyed French and I enjoyed language, and I knew that I found psychology really interesting. I just really found everybody's story really interesting. And growing up in Toronto, we have a really diverse population. So I just found human behavior and different perspectives really interesting. So I went to study those things. And then it turns out in the translation program that Anglophones are asked to take some technical writing classes to improve their employability, because normally you translate into your first language. And in Canada, there isn't a huge amount of demand for translators going into English. So I took those classes, and I did well because I do have an interest in technology and tinkered a lot when I was younger. And so Jamie Roberts, who actually is at Google now, he said to me, hey, would you be interested in doing a student placement for technical writing instead of translation? So I spent one summer working with Symantec, and they liked me so much that, and I had such a good time, that I continued to work with them as a student for another 2 semesters while I finished up my bachelor's degree. So I graduated with a bachelor's degree. I finished up the rest of the technical writing classes for a tech writing certificate. And I realized that tech writing combines the teaching skills I love, because I love knowledge sharing and teaching and enabling other people. It combines language, and it allows me to play with technology, which is something I always had done on the side, but never really had looked at as a career option. So it turned out to be a really good fit, and I had just fallen into it by accident.
Okay, that's very interesting to know, Nicola. So you have over 20 years of experience with content development, right?
Yeah, so I was with IBM for quite a long time. Jamie Roberts, who I'd mentioned earlier, was actually with IBM at the time and said, hey, why don't you come join IBM? And I did apply, but I had applied a few other places first. And again, I kind of like to take the sort of exploratory path. So I decided to go somewhere else first that wasn't a large company, did some exploration, trying a few jobs in a few different places. And then I ended up at IBM and was there for a good 15 years. So I really appreciate that I took that path, because, sometimes people say, oh, I'd really love to work at Google, or I'd really love to work somewhere like IBM that's well established. And you do get to learn a lot that way. But something I always tell students and other people who are early in their career is there's so much that you can learn from experiences in other places. You get to pioneer, you get to learn often a lot more about other parts of the business because you end up wearing different hats. So I'm really glad that I had that experience because it provides me with a broader perspective.
Right. I just wanted to know what was an important lesson you learned during your career that helped you to get where you are today with your 20 years of experience?
So yeah, one of the things for me that I've learned over time is I'm good at making connections between people and ideas. And when it comes to figuring out how I can contribute, I don't necessarily just look at what is established. So there are a variety of examples. Because I've been on teams where I was maybe more technically proficient than some of the other writers, I ended up helping to set up build automation on teams that didn't have it. When I joined a team during my time at IBM, that was an acquisition, and I realized they were using Jenkins for their doc build processes. I took that and started to build it out and provided a way for subject matter experts to also use that build automation. I then evangelized it throughout the company, and so that by the time I had left IBM, even at the corporate level, they were starting to use Jenkins to provide builds for writers across the company. So I've always found that there are opportunities to contribute, even if there aren't formal roles or responsibilities. There are always ways to have impact, and that has helped me a lot throughout my career.
Super. So let's just talk about a little bit on your documentation process at Google. So can you shed some lights on what are you currently doing to make sure the documentation is all up to date and is serving the purpose?
So I know that you had Mike Pope on the podcast earlier this year, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm also in Google Cloud. So a lot of the process that Mike talked about is going to be the same. So we have what's often referred to as a docs as code kind of model. So we use the same kinds of tools that the software engineers use. So we have source control for both documentation and the code in the same repository. We use the same tools for reviewing both code and documentation. And there are some built-in checks both in our editor and as a part of the review tools that help to verify certain things like branding usage, certain requirements around approval, for example. So there are a bunch of different checks that are in place. And we do require for external documentation to make sure that things go through a review process so that there's always a second pair of eyes on things before they get published. In some cases, if it's just a typo, it might be a peer review only. And then in other cases, again, depending on what the content is, you might need to get it reviewed by a subject matter expert as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and how do you manage your documentation workflow, Nicola?
So can you clarify what you mean by manage?
So I'm guessing there will be a lot of teams that you interact during the documentation process. So how do you manage the overall project of making sure the right things are captured at the right time and then translated into writing?
That actually is going to vary by team. It's actually quite interesting. When new writers join Google, one of the questions they often ask is, what is the typical way that you, or what is the way that we manage our work? And the answer is that it actually depends. So there are a variety of tools we have available to us internally for project management, and So that's going to vary. It could be everything from a spreadsheet to some dedicated tools, or some Kanban style project management um, for tracking your tasks that are in progress as you go through your sprints. But in terms of team interaction, there are a variety of stakeholders that you might interact with. So in cloud, you might work with product managers to find out what requirements are from the user perspective. You might be involved with UX, both in design and in studies with customers to find out, again, directly from them what their needs are. There are on some teams a program manager who is responsible for the how, so product managers are looking at what do we need, and program managers look at how. So they look at schedule, they try to unblock people in sort of the large across the whole product team. And then writers might interact with that schedule in a variety of ways. If they're supporting one project primarily, they may be more integrated with whatever program management process there is for tracking the work. And if they're not, then they may have relationships with multiple teams and have agreements with when they're going to deliver things. Mm-hmm. And then in addition to those stakeholders, there are the software engineers who are working on the specific features, and there might be relationships with other writers as well, because a lot of these services in Google Cloud interact with each other. So there are cases where you might need to document something like permissions or private networking, and those kinds of features you want to document in a consistent way. So you might be collaborating with other writers on how to document those things. You might be working on a use case that goes across Google Cloud and several products. So you might also collaborate with other writers to document those pieces.
It's very interesting to see how things roll out. And you did mention that you were very excited to work for such a big company. So I know there's hiring everywhere, including Google. So with someone who has extensive experience, what advice would you give to someone looking to enter into this field?
So I would go back to some of what I said earlier, that I think one of the things that has really helped me is I have looked for opportunities everywhere. So that includes, when I've worked in smaller places, and yes, I was responsible for documentation, but there were other times where marketing came to me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in working on some white papers, or would you be interested in working on putting together some animation for us?" And I like playing with technology and I like learning stuff. So taking those opportunities. When I got to Google, the big thing where I looked at opportunities that I can provide as an example is the tech writer onboarding. So when I got to Google, the orientation for people in technical roles is very focused on the software engineering role. And so there are places in the orientation where it just doesn't feel very relevant to writers. And this isn't just a Google thing. Like, this is an experience that a lot of writers go through, no matter what organization there is. A lot of times the writer role just isn't heavily focused on, right? And then there are also things like career development, where it's not really clear how your career development is going to progress through the company. So I saw those kinds of gaps and said, "Hey, we should create some writer-specific education." And a lot of teams had done that in their own little teams. But that means information scattered everywhere, and your onboarding is only as good as the resources and network you have when you join. So manager said, "Hey, go for it." And I got some people together, and we put together education now that I'm really happy happened in 2019, because when we hit 2020 and we started expanding into locations like Warsaw and Bangalore, it's allowed us to provide a much more consistent experience in onboarding, particularly in places where we don't have experienced Google writers who've been here for years to pass down knowledge informally. We now have some consistent training that provides people with a equal foundation when they start.
Mhm.
And that's not something that I was assigned to do. Again, that was an opportunity. So I really am a big advocate for, um, don't just look for, don't just look around you and say, well, I'm mostly in a support role and there isn't really much area for growth or learning for me, or I'm working under marketing and there isn't really an opportunity for growth for me, or I'm in a really small company and there isn't opportunity necessarily for growth if I just focus on docs. I think there are lots of opportunities to learn, and then you can take those opportunities and either build a new career path for yourself if you like something more than the writing, or you can take those skills and then build a larger scope for yourself in your existing company, or take those skills to the next opportunity that you have.
That's nice. So the more and more I hear from you, it looks like the place gives you a lot of opportunities to grow, not only in your current field, but also in various other aspects.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I do enjoy working for larger companies, is because there is that opportunity to really have a new job without having to start fresh in a new company. So it's something that that's one of the reasons I was able to stay at IBM for so many years, is because I didn't just stay on one team and I wasn't just focused on documentation. I was involved in some initiatives that spanned the whole company, some of it grassroots and some of it not. And that just kept things really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, just following on that question, Nicola. So, how important is it for technical writers to consider accessibility when creating a document, just to have all these different levels of interactions and exposure?
Yeah, so I do have a background in accessibility. I'm actually visually impaired myself. I have about 10% vision. I'm light sensitive. And I have very special eyes. So accessibility is something that's really important to me. And it's really something that I like to try to explain to people isn't just something that you need to do because it helps people with disabilities. Creating an experience where people can access information in different ways, access the product in different ways, is useful to everybody, because we all run into situations where we aren't able to use products and services the way that we might normally. So, I remember when I had shingles and I couldn't use one arm really well because it had shingles all over it. And that really limited my ability to type, right? And it was a temporary thing, but it affected my productivity. If you're driving in fog, you can't see as well. If you've got, a baby in your arms and you don't want to make a lot of noise, you might want to turn on captions. If you're cooking, you might also want to use voice control with some sort of feature like Google Assistant or Alexa or Siri, right? So it's something that really helps everyone. So I think accessibility is something important to think about no matter what you're working on. Even if you don't have a mandate to make your product accessible, it really just creates better user experiences.
Very true, and nicely said, Nicola. Let's just talk about some reporting on your documentation. So, how do you report on your documentation, and who do you report to?
In terms of status or metrics or both?
Yeah, maybe both, or more on the metrics.
So I think Mike touched on this when you interviewed him. We do have Google Analytics available to us. So we're able to set up a variety of cloud-wide dashboards that allow us to see things like, page views, maybe, an aggregate where some of the visits are coming from, that kind of thing. And that gives us a sense, it doesn't tell us everything, but it allows us to look at things and maybe identify maybe topics that need to be clarified, because maybe people are looking at it quickly and leaving and not continuing on somewhere else. Or you may look at, certain metrics and compare them with support tickets and see if changes that you've made have reduced your support load. So we have that kind of thing. I mean, in terms of status, that's going to vary, and that tends to relate to how you're tracking your work. We do have the same bug tracking system that a lot of people use across Google, so not just within software engineering, but a lot of groups use the same bug tracking tool. So that integrates with a lot of our other systems and allows for visibility around work that's being done in a variety of ways. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, Nicola, that's really great. And again, coming from such a huge experience, in your opinion, what has been the most important innovation when it comes to document tracking? Yeah.
When it comes to document tracking, I think something that for me has made a big difference, and I would say it makes a big difference for sure at Google. And I know that when I was using tools at IBM that did something similar, it was also very helpful. I really like having a tightly integrated experience between the work that writers do and the work that the rest of the product team is doing. And that the more integrated it is, the more visibility that the writers have. So for example, if you were tracking your work in different tools, you then have to remember to report it to your stakeholders. And you have to, continually, wave your hand and lift your hand and say, hey, I've got this stuff going on over here. And if everything's integrated in one tool, you can set up relationships. You can say, hey, I have this piece of work and it's blocked by some work that a software engineer is doing, or, the product manager hasn't finished their requirements document and I'm blocked on that. And I can then add, the tracking bug for that work and say, I have a dependency on this. So having integrations like that for me has made a big difference in my productivity. Using the same tools that the software engineers use also takes away a lot of friction, because instead of having to say, hey, can you use this review tool over here? And you have to learn how to use it and you have to remember to do it. And if you haven't done it in 3 months, you have to remember how to do it all over again. If you're reviewing documentation with the same tools that you use to do code reviews, you don't have to learn anything new, and it just feels like you're doing the same job that you always do. So it really takes a lot of the friction away. And I have found experiences like that make a huge difference in my ability to get my work done, in the visibility of what I do, and just ensures that we work better as a team.
Thanks. Again, I just want to ask this question. Is Google currently generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
So again, what do you mean by organic search traffic?
So if your documentation is publicly available, the marketing team can pull out some search traffic, and that will help you to improvise your documentation, which areas they are searching the most and what topics are being looked at. So those kind of it can help you with your optimization, search engine optimization. So are you aware of any such activities happening within your knowledge base?
So I haven't dug deeply into the SEO stuff. I know that we can do some things around search, not only for the documentation, but for example, using the Google Cloud UIs. And when people are searching for keywords in the console, we want to make sure that they get the right help for what they're looking for. So we can look at patterns around that. We can look at patterns around what people are searching for in the documentation. But again, I haven't dug deeply into the other side of that in terms of how we might specifically address what we find. I started with Google in 2019, and there's some things I have dug into, but the SEO is not one of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. No problem at all. So if you're good, we can just quickly move on to our rapid fire round questions.
Sure.
Super. Who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
That I spent some time thinking about this one, and I think like some of your other guests, I would say that I don't have the ability to pick just one, but as I said, when I started in tech writing, the thing that brought me to tech writing was doing a student placement that really showed me what the career would be like, and Jamie Roberts was involved in pointing me in that direction. So I may have just taken the classes and thought, oh, hey, here's some cool skills, and yeah, I'm pretty good at this. But if I hadn't had that opportunity to really work that summer and get a taste of what it would be like to be a tech writer, I might not be where I am today. So I'm definitely grateful for having had that experience. I'd say that in terms of learning, what I'm focused on now is less about writing and more about relationships. So again, going back to like my interest in psychology, I think I tend to focus on that now in terms of my learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Well, I just purchased the Docs for Developers book that just came out a few weeks ago, and I'm really excited about having a look at that because it's a book that's aimed at primarily at software developers. So instead of providing a book, we have a number of books out there. Like there's Docs Like Code, there's The Product is Docs that the Splunk team put together. There's some really good books out there that are targeting documentarians and people who already have an interest in that, may have some familiarity with writing best practices. And so your starting point is a little different, whereas this book really is focused on helping people who have a need to put together documentation, but aren't even in the place where they have explored best practices around docs. And so it really takes you through the full life cycle of documentation and all the considerations around that. So I'm very interested in seeing how we do that, and I'm pretty excited about it because we're bringing documentation to the developers, and we're equipping people with knowledge to help onboard developers as well into some documentation best practices. So if you were responsible for working with subject matter experts on your teams and helping them to write better or make a case for why they need to be involved in documentation and how we can set that up, I'm hoping that this book will also help with some of that as well.
Thank you for that wonderful resource, Nicola. My last question to you is, what is that one piece of documentation related advice you would like to give to your 20-year-old self?
Documentation advice. I would actually probably give myself advice that isn't specifically documentation related, but I guess it's something that a lot of writers might relate to, and that's to really prioritize and not be afraid to ask for help and delegate. One of the things that you sometimes do when you're early in your career and you're really eager and enthusiastic and you want to learn everything is you try to take on everything. And I mean, it's great. You learn a lot. You often get recognized for the extra stuff that you do. But at a certain point, you can't handle everything. And the other thing is that you sometimes, if you become really good at certain things, particularly on teams, you don't want to be the only go-to person that has all the knowledge. You want to be able to make sure that you are lifting up the entire team and sharing that knowledge so that If you're sick, if you're on vacation, someone else can help with that. But in addition, that you're also supporting the careers of other people, and you're not taking all of that stuff for yourself. So, I would tell my 20-year-old self that A, it's okay to ask for help, and B, that it's also okay to delegate when you've got a lot on your plate.
Thank you. So another wonderful advice and suggestions to all those youngsters and people who are looking forward to take this as a serious career. Great. So did I miss to ask you anything, Nicola, but you would like to add to our audience today?
I guess because I have some interest, again, like I said, in sort of psychology and organizational psychology in particular. A lot of people focus on things like learning tools and learning writing. And I think a big part of what we do is also managing relationships, because we work with so many stakeholders. Understanding how to work really well with people is important. And if that doesn't come to you naturally, or if it's something that you're new to navigating, I really lately have been enjoying listening to podcasts like the ones by Brené Brown, who's done a lot of research into vulnerability and shame previously, but now she also focuses on how a lot of these learnings apply to leadership. People like Adam Grant, who does a whole work-life podcast that focuses on organizational psychology. And there's just a lot to learn about leadership, and a lot to learn about just how to work with people, that I think comes from that, and that can help you navigate relationships within the day-to-day work you do as documentarian.
Thank you. So thank you for that additional points as well, Nicola. So once again, I appreciate all the information you have shared with us today in the last 30 minutes or so. And definitely, it's quite a interesting session to our audiences. And I wish you all the very best for the projects and future documentation engagement you're going to have. And take care and have a good day.
Thanks, Gowri. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledgebase Ninjas Podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.